We now move to priority area 4, where we look at managing financial and macrofiscal issues. These terms are very important for economists in terms of what they actually refer to: tax revenues and spending by the government, and fiscal issues, micro and macro, and so on and so forth. The monsoon was late this year arriving in Mumbai. It's finally arrived and it's raining nicely. And I tried to find the angle which would reduce the glare in my eyes, but I cannot in this room, in my place, and you probably don't care anyways. So nonetheless, if you do care, it's distracting, then send me a message. Alright, so here this is expected to fit into finance. Climate change impacts, whether through slow changes or shocks, and the adaptation actions that households, firms, and investors take can influence macroeconomic aggregates such as GDP, trade balance, inflation, or public debt, which we'll see in a figure in a minute. So these are the macro economic aggregates. So already you get some sense of what the economists are talking about with these different terminologies. They may also lead to changes in asset values or financial risks that are large enough to threaten the stability of the financial system. Because they have macro level implications, climate and disaster risks cannot be managed by individual households, firms, or investors alone. So macro scale is, of course, macro level is country level, regional level, and beyond individual households for sure, and also beyond firms and investors. There also needs to be public action, especially in assessing, monitoring, and regulating financial and macrofiscal risks. So this has to be part of the adaptation. I will also record a couple of reports from IMF on more of the fiscal issues related to adaptation, which are very important because it's all about money, how much we have to invest and what will be the return on the investments, including worrying about longer term investments in infrastructure, energy, etc., and the discounting that we have to do for spending now for future benefits. How do we value the benefits in the future with our investments today, and who are we investing it for? There is generally an assumption that posterity will do better anyways, and so on. So we'll come back to that later. The channels through which climate change can affect macrofiscal and financial issues, financial aggregates. It's got physical, health, and crop models, real economy, macrofiscal, and financial aspects that we have looked at before. This gets input from and feeds back to the socio-political issues, which also we have looked at. So I'll go back to the slide in a minute. So socio-political issues typically consist of migration, conflicts, political issues, and redistribution of gains and losses. So this feedback and all aspects to these physical, health, and crop models, climate scenarios come in, physical impacts, so reduction in yield, disaster damages, labor productivity, etc. are considered here. So these are the channels through which climate change can cascade into the macrofiscal and financial aggregates. In terms of real economy, coming from this side, we have impact on firms' operations and investment choices, for example, using supply chain models, impact on economic sectors using partial equilibrium sector models such as agriculture sector model, impact on public assets, so infrastructure, schools, etc., government spending needs, so social protection and total public expenditure, impact on households, welfare, and behaviors, so home maintenance and operations, health expenditures, labor productivity, and skills, etc. So there's a feedback between the real economy and macrofiscal and financial aggregates, which damp or magnify impacts on the real economy. So you can have positive and negative effects. Macroeconomic impacts include GDP, trade balance, and inflation, as we saw with various models. So computable general equilibrium and structural models, input-output models for post-disaster, empirical approaches, etc. Asset values include land, housing, equity, bonds, and loans, and financial system stabilities consider urban economy models, stress test methodologies, and financial modeling, etc. In the end, we have fiscal implications in public finances under macro fiscal financial aggregates, so deficit debt using macro structural models. Where does it take us? Looking at some screening questions, identify actions to mitigate financial and macro fiscal risks. Through its impacts on people and firms, climate change has the potential to cause system-wide impacts on economies. Are countries and governments well prepared to manage fiscal and financial shocks alongside the long-term structural changes that climate change could bring? So business as usual pretty much may get become obsolete if climate change continues to grow in its impacts and multiple cascades through the system. The following questions can help decision makers identify shortcomings and guide them towards the actions needed to mitigate financial and macrofiscal risks. Obviously, we'll go on to then look at the various action items which we looked at in the summary briefly. Financial protection strategy is the first action on this list. Does the government have an assessment of contingent liabilities associated with different natural hazards? Does the government have contingency plans and financing instruments that can mobilize the resources needed to respond to a shock? Could include post-disaster public finance management, so that's PFM assessment, clear earmarking, defined accountabilities, targeting. Oops, did I cut off something there? I hope not. Okay, so action 4.2, mitigating macroeconomic impacts. Are the possible long-term macroeconomic impacts of disasters and climate change assessed and planned for? Obviously, when you talk about future risks, there are always uncertainties, so there are judgment calls to be made. Is the uncertainty properly considered in that sense that global warming is one thing, but nobody lives in global mean temperatures and sea level rise? Converting global warming into local impacts and disasters is not very trivial, and models are not always very good at this, especially beyond a couple of seasons. These should include implications for GDP and long-term debt sustainability in multiple scenarios. Okay. Action 4.3, a resilient financial system is very critical. Have climate stress tests of the financial system been conducted and potential shortcomings addressed? Should include publicly disclosed stress tests of banks, insurers, institutional investors, and pension funds, regulations to mitigate financial sector risks. I have separate podcasts on how the Network for Greening the Financial Systems is putting out ways to test the banks, for example, central banks, and then US has converted it to its own set of recommendations as well in terms of taking acute and chronic risks from climate change side and converting it into financial risks in terms of investments, defaults, etc. Okay, so those are always critical. Have regulators and financial supervisory authorities assessed the vulnerability of the financial system and introduced specific recommendations or regulations? This includes large firms and investors reporting annually on their exposures to climate and disaster risks. These are not comprehensive by any means. They're just given as examples. Okay, so looking at contingent liabilities that only materialize if a certain event occurs. For example, if the roads are damaged by flood, the government is responsible for repairing them. There are two types of contingent liabilities. We talked about acceptable and non-acceptable risks. So even if private contractors built the roads and floods come along, that may not necessarily be included as part of the portfolio of management by the private company that built the roads. It has to go back to the government. Explicit contingent liabilities are relatively easy to estimate based on public asset and infrastructure inventories. For example, if the state owns the public roads, it's responsible for fixing them. Of course, there are parts of the highway systems that are typically owned by private entities which collect tolls, and then those funds are expected to be used to maintain the roads and fix them even in the case of climate hazards. Implicit liabilities are linked to other expectations or forms of commitment and are more difficult to estimate. For example, governments are expected to support populations affected by disaster and provide humanitarian and financial resources. Sample targets, I will go to the toolbox in the next. I keep going back and forth because I want to plan where to stop the podcasts. Sample targets and indicators include things like risk to public assets and corresponding contingent liabilities are assessed. Emergency and social protection spending needs and corresponding contingent liabilities are also assessed. Explicit and implicit contingent liabilities are quantified and included in the budget documents. Risk to GDP and tax revenues estimated and included in budget documents. So climate disasters can make such a situation that people lose their incomes, businesses shut down, and get trapped in a situation that cannot be linked to the outside world for some time. So tax revenues begin to get affected. And looking here at figure 14, funding of the government of Fiji's explicit contingent liability from public assets and infrastructure. So probabilistic analysis here with public contingent liability in this is Fijian dollars in millions. So this is Fiji dollars. So we are looking at funding of the government of Fiji's explicit contingent liability in terms of reserve fund and contingent credit, catastrophic insurance, and unfunded public contingent liability. So these colors are different here, as you can see. So this is average. So here we are in terms of the numbers and the various categories. So large part is unfunded contingent liability, which obviously is something that has to be planned properly. Once in 50-year event of probabilistic analysis has some reserve funds, some contingent credit, and catastrophe insurance, but there is a large unfunded public contingent liability there. Once in 100 years, obviously the fundings go up a little, not so much in terms of the contingent credit, but the catastrophic insurance coverage goes up, but you can see unfunded public contingent liability goes up by a lot as well. Tropical cyclone Winston, it played out with reserve funds, contingent credit, and catastrophe insurance, but there was still quite a bit of unfunded public contingent liability left there. Okay, so we'll come back and look at this toolbox G in the next podcast. This chapter, this section is kind of long, and each of these toolboxes are quite long as well, with certain quantitative approaches being suggested. And since this is economy, finance, fiscal stuff, I'm not an expert, so I'll try my best to translate the adaptation principles for you, but there is a lot of material provided in terms of references that you should follow up with in case this is of interest for you in further details. Okay, so I'll see you in the next podcast.